And so we open at the close. This is going to be the last of our classes on Tefillah, on the Man of Faith, and on the Rav Soloveitchik in general. This will be the last class of this course. It's going to talk about Tefillah, but we're going to do that by going back to a section from the Man of Faith we skip in our Man of Faith Shiurim, which talks about Tefillah, about prayer, by comparing it and sort of aligning it with prophecy, and talking about the idea that the community of Adam 1, the community of prayer, is the continuation of the community of prophecy. So today we're going to talk about the several ways, essentially four, ways that the prayer continues prophecy, or the community of prayer continues the community of prophecy. And we're going to finish by looking at how several of those ways actually sort of are broader themes within Rav Soloveitchik's works as a whole. So without further ado, source number one. With the sound of the divine voice addressing man by his name, be it Abraham, Moses, or Samuel, God, whom man has sought among the endless trails of the universe, is discovered suddenly as being close to and intimate with man, standing just opposite or beside him. At this meeting, initiated by God of God and man, the covenantal prophetic community is established. When man addressed himself to God, calling him in the informal, friendly tones of thou, the same miracle happens again. God joins man, and at this meeting, initiated by man, a new covenantal community is born, the prayer community. So the fundamental idea of prophecy that Rav Soloveitchik wants to get at here is that prophecy is what he calls a community of God and man, but more specifically a relationship, and it's a sort of face-to-face dialogue relationship where you can talk to God, somebody talking to another person. And in prophecy, that happens when God takes the time to come to man, as it were, and speak to him. He gives examples of Abraham, Moshe, Shmuel. He calls to Abraham Lech Lecha, sort of out of nowhere, but then Moshe at the burning, comes to Moshe at the burning bush. I think Shmuel might be the best example, because Shmuel is sort of a child in the Mishkan when he hears God just calling to him, and he doesn't know who it is, and he goes to the Kohen Gadol Eli, and Eli says, "It's God." Wait in place and sort of respond to God as they're coming to me. And that informal, familiar dialogue is what we continue in Tefillah. The Tefillah presents an opportunity to position yourself as someone speaking to God. Da with name I made no before him you stand. That you see yourself as standing before God. Kilo made and you speak to God. And so the way that Tefillah at a fundamental level continues prophecy is by the sort of recreating the stance of standing before God and talking to God. It's just that this time the initiative has changed. Instead of it being a response to God's initiative, it's our initiative to make ourselves someone who's in relationship with God, to go and speak to God, and then God is taken to be responding or present in the prayer community. That, as I said last time, it's less important for Rav Soloveitchik the ways in which God responds to our prayers, so much as this is a creation of intimate community with God. So the rest of the class, we're going to discuss several aspects of this covenantal dialogue, the relation of ethics in Tefillah, of halakhah in Tefillah, and finally Tefillah and mesorah. So we'll launch it here into dialogue. Source number two, I have termed both communities, the prophetic and the prayerful, covenantal, because of the threefold reason. In both communities, a confrontation of God and man takes place. It is quite obvious that prophecy awareness, which is toto genera, different from the mystical experience, can only be interpreted in unique categories of the covenantal event. The whole idea of prophecy would be fraught with an inner contradiction if man's approach to God remained indirect and impersonal, expecting nature to mediate between him and his creator. Only within the covenantal community, which is formed by God descending upon the mountain and And man, upon the call of the Lord ascending to the mount, is a direct personal relationship expressing itself in the prophetic face-to-face colloquy established. And the Lord spake unto Moses face-to-face as man speaketh unto his friend. Prayer is likewise unimaginable without having man stand before and address himself to God in a manner reminiscent of the prophet's dialogue with God. The cosmic drama, notwithstanding its grandeur and splendor, no matter how distinctly it reflects the image of Creator and no matter how beautifully it tells His glory, cannot provoke man to prayer. Right? So this idea of the community with God is what Rav Soloveitchik calls a covenant of brit. And this introduces the fundamental assumption of both prayer and tefillah. It's something super informal, intimate in some sense, not related to the nature of the world and how grand the world is, so much as our ability just to come to God from the deepest parts of ourselves. Source number 3. Indeed, the prayer community was born the very instant the prophetic community expired, and when it did come into the spiritual world of the Jew of old, it did not supersede the prophetic community, but rather perpetuated it. Prayer is the continuation of prophecy, and the fellowship of prayerful men is ipso facto the fellowship of prophets. The difference in prayer and prophecy is, as I have already mentioned, related not to the substance of the dialogue, but rather to the order in which it is conducted. While within the prophetic community, God takes the initiative. He speaks and man listens. In the prayerful community, the initiative belongs to man. He does the speaking and God the listening. The word of prophecy is God's and is accepted by man. The word of prayer is man's and God accepts it. The two halachic traditions tracing the origin of prayer to Abraham and the other patriarchs and attributing the authorship of statutory prayer to the men of the Great Assembly reveal the Judaic view of the sameness of prophecy and prayer communities. Covenantal prophecy and prayer blossomed forth the very instant Abraham met God and became involved in a strange colloquy. At a later date, when the mysterious man of this wondrous assembly witnessed that bright summer day of the prophetic community, full of color and sound, turned into a bleak autumnal night of dreadful silence, unillumined by the vision of God or made homely by His voice, they refused to acquiesce in this cruel historical reality. They would not let the ancient dialogue between God and men come to an end. For the men of the Great Assembly knew that the withdrawal of the colloquy from the field of consciousness of the Judaic community, the latter would lose the intimate companionship of God and consequently its covenantal status. In prayer they found the salvation of the colloquy, which they insisted must go on forever. If God had stopped calling man, they urged, let man call God. So the covenantal colloquy was shifted from the level of prophecy to that of prayer. I think what's most important here is not even just the definition of prayer as a continuation of prophecy and as some sort of intimate standing before God, but the recognition that this colloquy, this community, which He's previously defined as covenant, is fundamentally constituted, is created and based on, created by and based on the dialogue that is either prophecy or prayer. So once upon a time, the Jewish community, the Jewish people, were God's people because of prophecy. But then prophecy disappears, and suddenly the men of the Great Assembly, have to figure out what it means to be Jewish without prophecy. And they say what it means to be Jewish without prophecy is to keep talking to God even when God's not talking to us, as it were, to Hester Panim, that we remain God's people, but this time it's not an accident. This time it's not something that God does to us. It's something that's essential to who we are. It's something that we do. I think this reading brings to mind the Gemara about that at Har Sinai, God forced the Jewish people to accept the Torah in some sense, but then at Purim, in the absence of any obvious divine intervention, the Jewish people choose to keep the Torah and choose to perpetuate their existence as God's people. That, in the sense, with leaving Egypt and Har Sinai, God chose the people and made them into His people. At Purim, at the end of prophecy, as it were, and the beginning of the oral Torah, which is often associated with either Purim or Hanukkah, then that is when there's a switch and it becomes that man is perpetuating the Torah, and man is the one choosing to be God's people. Man, in the sense, specifically being the Jews. So what tefillah represents is not just our ability to speak to God, but our ability to keep being Jewish, and choosing to keep being Jewish. And last time we spoke a little bit about the centrality of prayer and sort of the redemption of tefillah in the way Rambam made it central. I think, if anything, Rav Soloveitchik here has made it even more central. in a very striking way. The next aspect of prophecy and Tefillah talks about is ethics, the other people involved in the two processes. Source number 4, both the prophetic and prayerful communities are threefold structures consisting of all three grammatical personae, I, thou, and he. You can't talk about dialogue, the I speaking to the you, without also talking about the he, the other people around you. The prophet in whom God confides, and to whom he confides, and to whom he entrusts his eternal word, must always remember that he is the representative of the many anonymous they for whom the message is earmarked. No man, however great and noble, is worthy of God's word if he fancies that the word is his private property, not to be shared by others. There's some really wonderful descriptions of, in Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel alike, all very different but powerful descriptions of sort of not like having prophecy and not wanting to share it. I think Yirmiyahu is really a favorite description of the prophecy being like fire in his bones when he tries to hold it back. It's almost painful. He has to share it with the people for whom it was intended. The prayerful community must not likewise remain a twofold affair, a transient I addressing himself with the eternal he. The inclusion of others is indispensable. Man should avoid praying for himself alone. The plural form of prayer is of central halachic significance. When disaster strikes, one must not be immersed completely in his own passional destiny, thinking exclusively of himself, being concerned only with himself, petitioning God merely for himself. The foundation and efficacious, apologies, I don't know how to pronounce that word, efficacious and noble prayer is human solidarity and sympathy with the covenantal awareness of existential togetherness, of sharing and experiencing the travail and suffering of those for whom the majestic Adam the first has no concern. Only Adam the second knows the art of praying, since he confronts God with the petition of the many. The fenced-in, egocentric, and ego-oriented Adam the first is ineligible to join the covenantal prayer community of which God is a fellow member. Right, so we spoke last time about the way human suffering and tefillah are simultaneous parts of the creation of a community. But here Rav Soloveitchik takes a step past that and says that the community of tefillah is, and even tefillah of the individual, is always a praying for every other member of that community. And he actually connects this to the idea of communal prayer, that we don't just pray as individuals. We always, or sort of ideally, pray as members of a minyan, as part of a representative group, number of people that represent the community. And that tefillah is never just for yourself, and notably that most of the Shemona Esrei is for national concerns, not for individual concerns per se. That our tefillah is very deeply concerned with the way we are part of a group larger than ourselves. And what else is sort of alluding to here as well? He in the text goes on to speak like that. This is sort of what Eov has to learn through the Sefer Eov, is that to be only concerned with your own suffering and not with that of others is a fundamental abandoning of responsibility. And in his language, in Limited Faith, might call it the demonic, the refusal to recognize the suffering and humanity of other people. So davening with a minyan, in a sense, becomes a fulfillment of recognizing the humanity of everyone around you. But it's not just about sort of ethics. He also talks about the relationship between tefillah and halakhah. So it's number 5. Both communities sprang into existence not only because of the singular experience of having met God, but also and perhaps mainly because of the discovery of the normative kerygma. Kerygma just means message, entailed in this very experience. Any encounter with God, if it is to redeem man, must be crystallized and objectified as a normative ethico-moral message. If, however, the encounter is reduced to its non-kerygmatic and non-imperative aspects, no matter how great and magnificent an experience it is, it cannot be classified as a covenantal encounter, since the very semantics of the term covenant implies freely assumed obligations and commitments. Encountering God has to be about actually encountering a God who tells you what he wants. Encounter any other person. If you say, I want to speak to you, I'm open to hearing from you, but you're not actually open to being told things by the other person, being told they want things from you, then you're not really open to them. This point in the book, Rav Soloveitchik, in some sense, claims that only the Orthodox can be truly open to God, because they're willing to hear God's law. And I'm not sure that's the most sympathetic or fair reading of non-Orthodox texts, but I think there's something very real about it, and it puts Rav Soloveitchik in a spectrum of thinkers like Franz Rosenzweig and Emmanuel Levinas, who are very aware that dialogue and openness to the other can be a very harsh and demanding experience, not simply one of mutual reinforcement and care. Source number 6, the above said, which is true of the universal faith community in general, has particular validity for the Halakhic community. The prime purpose of revelation, in the opinion of halakhah, is related to the giving of the law. The God-man confrontation serves as a didactic goal. God involves himself in the covenantal community through the medium of teaching and instructing. The halakhah has looked upon God since time immemorial as the teacher par excellence. The educational task was in turn entrusted to the prophet, whose greatest ambition is to teach the covenantal community. In short, God's word is ipso facto God's law and norm. Right? So prophecy actually takes the form of teaching in the God-man relationship. It's sort of educational, sort of how to live as God wants. And now I want to look at some of the pivot to prayer here. Source number 7. Let me add that for Judaism, the reverse would not only be unthinkable, but immoral as well. If we were to eliminate the norm from the prophetic God-man encounter, confining the latter to its apocalyptic aspect, then the whole prophetic drama would be acted out by a limited number of privileged individuals to the exclusion of the rest of the people. Such a prospect, from the viewpoint of Halakhic Judaism, which is exoterically minded and democratic to its very core, and we'll come back. This is the important point here. It's exoterically minded and democratic to its very core. The democratization of the God-man confrontation is made possible by the centrality of the normative element in prophecy. Only the norm engraved upon the 2 tablets of stone, visible and accessible to all, draws the people into this confrontation. You are placed this day, all of you, before the Eternal, your God, your heads of your tribes, your elders, your bailiffs, all the men of Israel, from the hewer of thy wood into the drawer of thy water. It's from Parshat Nitzavim. And how can the wood chopper and the water drawer participate in this adventurous meeting of God and man, if not through helping in a humble way to realize this covenantal norm? So here's explaining, in a sense, the, let's say, ethical significance of halakhah, what he calls the democratization of the God-man confrontation. Halakhah is somehow democratic, that, in a sense, we can't, if you get rid of halakhah, if you get rid of the structure of obligation and fulfillment through action that halakhah represents, it becomes much harder to say everyone can be in an equal relationship with God, because other aspects of relationship with God, internal feelings, are much less in our control and not sort of given to everyone in the same way. In Vikashta Misham, he talks about it in context of Talmud Torah, that learning Torah is something intellectuals can do to a much greater degree, much more intense degree, in all their own unique ways than average people. But that is something, he says, is given to them as a gift, but is not actually significant to the core of Judaism in terms of halakhah. Halakhah, as opposed to learning Torah, is equal for everyone, democratic. It puts everyone on the same level. And just note that he doesn't get into questions of like egalitarianism between genders or between Jews and Kohanim. There are no average Jews and Kohanim. There's no way of claiming that there's no Jews who can keep every mitzvah. There's simply too many mitzvot that are not aimed at every Jew. But I think the point is every Jew has their own set of requirements, and those requirements can be fulfilled, and that's all that's demanded, is to meet your requirements through action. And it's not about creativity or anything like that. That might make it easier for some people and harder for others. Prayer likewise consists not only of an awareness of the presence of God, but of an act of committing oneself to God and accepting his ethical moral authority. Who is qualified to engage God in the prayer colloquy? Clearly the person is ready to cleanse himself of imperfection and evil. Any kind of injustice, corruption, cruelty, or the like desecrates the very essence of the prayer adventure, since it encases man in an ugly little world into which God is unwilling to enter. If man craves to meet God in prayer, he must purge himself of all that separates him from God. Halakha has never looked upon prayer as a separate magical gesture in which man may engage by integrating into the total pattern of his life. God hearkens to prayer. It arises from the heart contrite over a muddled and faulty life, and from a resolute mind ready to redeem this life. In short, only the committed person is qualified to pray and to meet God. Prayer is always a harbinger of moral reformation. This is the reason why the prayer per se does not occupy a prominent place in the community as it does with other faith communities, and why prayer is not the great religious activity claiming, if not exclusiveness, at least centrality. Prayer must always be related to a prayerful life, which is consecrated to the realization of a divine imperative, and as such is not a separate entity, but the sublime prologue to halachic action. This is a fascinating bit, because the end of it seems to contradict what we talked about just before in the last week about the centrality of prayer. But I think it should be read more as a supreme qualification of prayer. It's really easy to see people who just want to daven all day. I mean, like, wouldn't it be great if a person could daven all day, and that was the entirety of tefillah? And there's a real ecstasy involved in a powerful tefillah, a moment to feel like you've encountered God, and you might want to just spend all day doing that. But much like Eov, I mentioned before, when the recognition of other people outside of your tefillah, you cannot just daven all day, sort of a moment of aloneness with God, and most particularly because you have to recognize that you're, like we have requirements outside of tefillah. Here he frames this in terms of morality, right? If you think tefillah is enough, you don't have to be moral. There's horrific about that. Absolutely horrific. But even if you think tefillah is enough of that halakhah, you've made yourself and your desires more important than the rule and the obligations incumbent upon you. You've also suggested that God cares more about talking to you than about you, folks returning to the world and acting in the world, and that Judaism, you've suggested Judaism is a religion of prayer as opposed to a religion of the world. And throughout Loving Man of Faith, Rav Soloveitchik will reiterate and repeat again and again that halakhah returns us to the world. This is a primary topic throughout Halakhic Man. The halakhah returns us to the world, and you cannot be sort of so obsessed with tefillah that it takes you out of your life and takes you out of communal life and takes you out of morality. And to do so is quite a desecration. For the last section here, we'll talk about the idea of mesorah. So, as we said at the beginning, tefillah is sort of face-to-face dialogue with God, a recognition of, your own inner life, and speaking from that place to God. You talk about the way that makes this part of a much larger sort of story, the way the prayerful and prophetic communities, the covenantal community, are not simply localized to this moment in history. Verse number 8, let us not forget that the covenantal community includes the he who addresses himself to man, not only from the now dimension, but also from the supposedly already vanished past. In the ashes of a dead before facticity, as well as from the as yet unborn future. For all boundaries establishing before, now, and after disappear when God the Eternal speaks. Right? So speaking to God means not just speaking to God in this moment as you would another person, but also speaking to the God of the past and the God of the future. Just to give us an aside, Franz Rosenzweig speaks about recognizing the importance of creation and redemption, not as, moments exactly like the present moment. It just happened to not be present and happened to be in the past, happened to be in the future. But as fundamentally different. So creation for Franz Rosenzweig represents the past as it shapes us. Recognizing that we have a history that we are a part of, which we cannot simply stand outside of. And something similar is happening here, recognizing that the past and the future make claims on us. God speaks to us from the past and the future, specifically as past and future. That we have a past that isn't simply an accident, but is in fact very important to determining who we are and what our responsibilities are, as we'll see in a second. Within the covenantal community, not only the contemporary individuals, but generations are engaged in the colloquy, and each single experience of time is three-dimensional, manifesting itself in memory, actuality, and anticipatory tension. So that's the past, present, and future. Memory, actuality, and anticipatory tension. This experiential triad, translated into moral categories, results in an awesome awareness of responsibility to a great past, which is handed down the divine imperative to the present generation in trust and confidence, to a mute future expecting this generation to discharge its covenantal duty conscientiously and honorably. The best illustration of such a paradoxical time awareness, which involves the individual, is the historic performance of the past. In the historic performance of the past, and makes him also participate in the dramatic action of an unknown future, can be found in the Judaic mesorah community. The latter represents not only a formal succession within the framework of calendaric time, but the union of the three grammatical tenses in an all-embracing time experience. Right? To be part of the mesorah is to have this crazy, this intense awareness of relationship with God in past, present, and future. The mesorah community cuts across the centuries, indeed millennia, of calendaric time, and unites those who already played their part, delivered their message, acquired fame, and withdrew from the covenantal stage quietly and humbly, with those who have not yet been given the opportunity to appear on the covenantal stage, and who wait for their turn in the anonymity of the about to be. What a beautiful phrase. Thus, the individual member of the covenantal community feels rooted in the past and related to the future. The before and the after are interwoven in his time experience. He is not a hitchhiker suddenly invited to get into a swiftly traveling vehicle which emerged from nowhere and which will be dropped into the abyss of timelessness, while the vehicle will rush on into parts unknown, continuing taking on new passengers and dropping the old ones. Covenantal man begins to find redemption from insecurity and to feel at home in the continuum of time and responsibility, which is experienced by him in its endless totality, me'olam va'ad olam, from everlasting even to everlasting. He is no longer an evanescent being, he is rooted in everlasting time and eternity itself. So covenantal man confronts not only a transient contemporary thou, but countless thou generations which advance toward him from all sides and engage him in the great colloquy in which God himself participates with love and joy. Being part of the mesorah means being in relationship with God, who's also God of the past and God of the future, but recognizing that God of the past speaks to you along with the voices of all of the other people for whom God was God of the past, present, and future. Specifically part of your past, your Jewish past. You're not some random person who's found God in this moment. You're part of the Jewish people who have found God historically and find God in this moment and will continue to seek out God in the future. And he speaks here of a form of redemption, of a sense of security that comes from being knowing who you are, that you are not cut adrift, you are not totally contextless and have to figure out your relationship with God on your own, that you are part of a community that stretches back to the prophets and stretches forward to redemption. So that is Tefillah. Tefillah is a moment of relationship with God, of sort of face-to-face dialogue with God that we perpetuate and we enact. And we have to do so with awareness of our responsibilities around us and awareness of responsibilities to God and halakhah. And doing so and maintaining that awareness ought to also extend to those around us, not just physically, but also those around us in time, and recognizing the way we are part of a much larger story than ourselves. But I want to note that we've talked about three different aspects today that have much larger resonances in Rav Soloveitchik's writings, specifically the perpetuation of prophecy, the idea that halakhah is democratic, and the idea of mesorah. These all show up in sort of three of Rav Soloveitchik's main books that he wrote or composed, Halakhic Man, and From There You Shall Seek, and The Lonely Man of Faith, the last being technically an essay composed from speeches he gave, but takes the form of a real book on its own. And all three of these, particularly as you get towards the end of them, but just in general, make reference to these 3 points. The perpetuation of prophecy, the idea of halakhah is democratic, and the mesorah. Halakhic Man ends with the whole discussion of making yourself into someone who could get prophecy. That for us, the normative aspect of the idea of prophecy is the demand we make ourselves into someone who could receive prophecy. And that is sort of echoed in what we saw today in the Lonely Man of faith, where we choose to enact the dialogue of prophecy, as opposed to in prophecy where God enacts that dialogue. But it also comes out from there you shall seek, where it talks about the way the word of the prophets is perpetuated through an ongoing chain of dialogues from the prophets to the people, the prophets who come after them, to their students, to the rabbis, etc. Each generation talking to the last and learning to identify with them and shaping themselves into part of this chain of dialogues. In very, very similar ways, the idea of halakhah being democratic appears in each one. And it's generally speaking an attack on the idea that somehow God would choose an elite with whom he wants to be in a relationship. No, God, as I said, gives everyone the same structure of obligation and fulfillment that can be fulfilled by conscious and intentional action. And the mesorah, again, a little different in each one. Halakhic Man, one of the, to me, most interesting parts of Halakhic Man is his deep fear of mortality and sense of fear of death, and it's the sense of mortality. And one of the ways in which he attempts to overcome death is by becoming part of a trans-historic community, being part of a mesorah of people talking about halakhah, the pilpul, the masau matan of Torah, debates about what the word of God means, what the Gemara means, what the Rishonim mean, are something that can continue today. And when you make yourself part of that community, you become part of a community that includes both Moshe Rabbeinu and Abaye and Rava and you yourself, unless you've sort of elevated yourself beyond the death of the individual. And there you shall seek is once again very similar to the prophecy, but it's about identifying not just with the individuals, stretching back to the prophets, but also with the very drive to pass on the mesorah and feeling driven to pass on the mesorah, recognizing you're part of a tradition that you are impelled to share with other people around you, and more importantly, to the next generation. In the sense of a recognizing that you are not just a passive receiver of tradition, but you are also a teacher of tradition. And then the man of faith, so we just saw about sort of paradoxical time awareness and recognizing that moral imperative. People in the past are depending on you to pass it forward. That maybe part of the mesorah. And at some level, I think there's three elements of prophecy, halakhah, and mesorah. So halakhah specifically being the democratic aspect of it, aren't like exactly a chiddush, right? It's not like Rav Soloveitchik is the only person concerned with them. I do think the idea of perpetuation of prophecy and finding new ways for prophecy to be relevant to our life is very interesting. But I think also in general, I think it's very interesting to see how Rav Soloveitchik is returning to these elements over time. Halakhic Man and from there you shall seek were written earlier in his career. Untitled Man Faith is much later. And he seems returning these elements and very concerned with their continued relevance to us and to our lives as Jews and to what it means to be Jewish. And I think in some sense that is, emblematic not just of Rav Soloveitchik, but of being Jewish in general, is to keep returning back to these elements and the rest of the elements of Judaism and exploring them anew and looking for their continued perpetual relevance in our lives. With that, I guess we're done. It's been an excellent year of classes, and thank you all.